Between 1838 and 1842, three Catholic convents across Louisiana purchased a combined total of 47 enslaved people to work their extensive landholdings. The practice was not unusual. Religious institutions across the South participated in the slave economy with the same casual brutality as any plantation owner. But in the archives of the Diocese of New Orleans, there exists a sealed file marked only with the words, Sister Mary Catherine, resolved 1842, not for public record. Inside that file are letters that reveal a love affair so forbidden, so impossible, that it would shatter the foundations of both the Catholic Church and plantation society. A story of a bride of Christ who broke every vow for a man whose name appeared in ledgers as nothing more than property. Before we continue with Sister Mary Catherine's story, hit that subscribe button and drop your state or city in the comments below. I want to know how far this forbidden tale reaches. The woman who chose God over everything. New Orleans, Louisiana, in the autumn of 1834, stood as the jewel of the Deep South, a city where French Catholic tradition collided with American Protestant expansion in ways that created both spectacular beauty and profound moral contradiction. The air smelled of magnolias and river mud, of coffee roasting in the French Quarter, and the sweat of thousands of enslaved people whose labor built the mansions that lined Esplanade Avenue. Among the city's most respected institutions was the Convent of the Sacred Heart, a compound of pristine white buildings surrounded by iron fencing that separated 23 nuns from the chaos of the world beyond. Sister Mary Catherine Bellamy had entered this sanctuary at 16 years old, fleeing a betrothal to a man 3 times her age, a wealthy cotton merchant whose first 2 wives had died in childbirth, and who saw in Catherine nothing more than a vessel for producing heirs. Her father, pragmatic and debt-ridden, had accepted the proposal without consulting her. Her mother, long dead from yellow fever, could offer no protection. The convent provided the only honorable escape from a marriage that terrified her more than the prospect of lifelong celibacy. For 4 years, Catherine had convinced herself that she had found her true calling. She rose at dawn for prayers, spent her mornings teaching orphan girls to read, devoted her afternoons to needlework that would be sold to fund charitable works, and retired each evening after complying with the certainty that she was serving God's purpose. The routine was suffocating, perhaps, but it was safe, and safety had become the highest virtue Catherine could imagine. But on the morning of March 14, 1838, when Mother Superior Agatha announced that the convent had purchased a plantation 40 miles upriver and needed volunteers to establish a mission there, something shifted in Catherine's carefully constructed certainty. The other nuns whispered nervously about the prospect of leaving the convent walls, about living in proximity to field workers and overseers, about the dangers of a plantation where proper supervision would be difficult to maintain. Catherine felt something different. Curiosity, perhaps even excitement. Emotions she had learned to suppress but which now surfaced with uncomfortable intensity. She volunteered immediately, surprising Mother Superior Agatha, who had expected Catherine, always so obedient and reserved, to be among those who declined. The Mother Superior studied her with an expression Catherine could not quite read, something between approval and suspicion, before accepting her offer with the warning that plantation life would test her faith in ways the sheltered convent never had. Catherine had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The preparation for departure consumed the following weeks. Catherine and 5 other nuns were instructed in the management of plantation accounts, the proper protocols for directing enslaved workers, and the importance of maintaining strict boundaries between themselves and those they would oversee. They were to be administrators of God's property, the bishop explained during a final blessing before their departure, bringing Christian efficiency to an enterprise that would fund hospitals, schools, and missions across the diocese. The bishop never used the word slavery, preferring instead to speak of workers and laborers, as if linguistic evasion could absolve the Church of participating in an institution that treated human beings as livestock. Catherine listened to these instructions with growing unease, but she did not voice her doubts. Doubt itself felt like sin, like weakness, like the failure to submit her will completely to God's purpose. She had spent 4 years learning to silence the voice inside her that asked uncomfortable questions. She would maintain that silence a while longer, unaware that her faith was about to be tested, not by the hardships of plantation life, but by something far more dangerous: the discovery that love could exist in places she had been taught it could never reach. The plantation that nuns built. St. Michael's Plantation occupied 800 acres of prime cotton land along a bend in the Mississippi River, where the water ran deep enough for steamboats and the soil produced yields that made even the most successful planters envious. The land had been bequeathed to the diocese by a wealthy widow named Marguerite Thibodeau, who had lost 3 sons to yellow fever and her husband to a gambling debt that ended with a pistol in his study. In her grief and guilt, she had decided to purchase salvation, leaving her entire estate to the Church with the stipulation that it be used to fund charitable works in perpetuity. The bishop, practical man that he was, recognized that charity required revenue, and revenue in Louisiana in 1838 meant cotton, and cotton meant enslaved labor. By the time he finalized the legal transfer, he had already calculated the plantation's potential yield, the market prices for premium long staple cotton, and the return on investment that would allow the diocese to expand its missionary work across the South. The moral mathematics of profiting from human bondage while preaching Christian virtue apparently presented no obstacle to his conscience. When Sister Mary Catherine and 5 other nuns arrived to take possession of the property in late April, they found a functioning plantation with 31 enslaved people whose labor had continued uninterrupted through the transfer of ownership. The enslaved workers, ranging in age from 14 to 67, lived in a row of cabins behind the main house, structures that were adequate by the brutal standards of the time, but which shocked Catherine with their stark contrast to the comfortable overseer's house where the nuns would reside. The cabins had dirt floors, gaps in the walls that let in rain and insects, and sleeping quarters so cramped that entire families shared single rooms with no privacy, no comfort, only the exhaustion that came from dawn to dusk labor in fields that stretched to the horizon. The nuns were to manage the operation with Christian efficiency, the Mother Superior had instructed, ensuring the workers were treated humanely according to church doctrine while maintaining the productivity that would fund their charitable mission. What Christian efficiency and humane treatment meant in practical terms was never clearly defined, and Catherine quickly discovered that the other nuns interpreted these phrases to suit their own comfort. Sister Beatrice focused obsessively on account books, tracking every expenditure down to the penny. Sister Agnes ensured the kitchen ran smoothly, directing enslaved cooks with military precision. Sister Teresa supervised fieldwork with detached efficiency, treating the enslaved workers as one might treat farm equipment, valuable property that required maintenance but deserved no emotional investment. Catherine found herself assigned to inventory management and correspondence, spending hours each day in the plantation office reviewing supply lists, placing orders for equipment, and maintaining records that would be audited by the diocese quarterly. It was tedious work, isolating work, and it gave her too much time to think about the uncomfortable questions she had been trained to suppress. How could an institution devoted to Christ's teachings, to the radical message of human dignity and divine love, participate so thoroughly in a system that denied both? The enslaved people she saw working the fields, serving meals, maintaining buildings, they were human beings with thoughts, feelings, families, dreams. The Church taught that all souls were equal before God, yet the plantation operated on the assumption that some souls were worth $900 at market, while others were priceless. These questions haunted Catherine through those first weeks at St. Michael's, but she voiced them to no one. maintaining the silence she had perfected in 4 years of convent life. She did not yet know that silence was about to become impossible, that her carefully constructed faith was about to collide with a reality that would force her to choose between the vows she had taken and the person she was becoming. The man sold. 3 times before his 25th birthday, his name in the convent's ledger was simply Marcus, purchased at the New Orleans slave market for $900 on April 3, 1838, valued for his unusual combination of physical strength and literacy, a dangerous pairing that his previous owners had alternatively exploited and feared. The bill of sale, written in the careful script of an auction house clerk, described him as male Negro, approximately 24 years of age, 6 feet in height, sound of body, able to read and cipher, no known defects or vicious tendencies, sold with standard warranty, against escape or infirmity. What the bill of sale did not record was the story those 24 years contained. Marcus had been born on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, the son of a woman whose name he barely remembered, and a white overseer who never acknowledged his existence. His first owner had been experimenting with the notion that literate slaves made better managers, teaching Marcus to read and do mathematics so he could supervise other workers and maintain crop records. The experiment had ended badly when the owner discovered that literacy also meant Marcus could forge travel passes, read abolitionist newspapers, and ask questions about legal concepts like property rights and habeas corpus. Marcus's second owner, a merchant in Charleston, had purchased him specifically for his literacy, using him to manage a warehouse and conduct business transactions that required someone who could read contracts and calculate prices. For 3 years, Marcus had lived a strange existence, trusted with significant responsibility during business hours, but chained in a storage room each night to prevent escape. The work had been tolerable, almost bearable, until the merchant's wife decided Marcus had looked at her with insufficient deference and demanded he be sold. Accusations of insolence, even imagined insolence, could get a man killed. Marcus had been fortunate only to be sold. His third owner had been the worst, a sugar plantation operator in Louisiana who worked enslaved people to death with the calculation that replacing them was cheaper than maintaining them. Marcus had spent 18 months cutting sugarcane in conditions that killed men within years, watching people collapse from heat exhaustion, seeing infected wounds turn fatal, because medical care cost money better spent on replacement workers. He had survived by being stronger than most, by keeping his literacy hidden, and by learning to make himself invisible when the overseer's mood turned violent. When the sugar plantation failed and its assets were liquidated, Marcus had found himself back at the New Orleans market, standing on an auction block while buyers examined his teeth, his hands, his scars, evaluating him with the same detachment they would use to evaluate livestock. The nuns who purchased him had been different from other buyers, their presence at the market unusual enough to draw attention. They had not touched him, had not asked him to demonstrate his strength or prove his health. They had simply reviewed his papers, confirmed his literacy, and paid the asking price without negotiation. Marcus had assumed his new owners would be like all the others, perhaps marginally less brutal because they were women religious, but ultimately operating from the same fundamental belief that he was property rather than person. He had learned through brutal experience not to hope for better treatment, not to expect mercy, not to mistake temporary comfort for genuine humanity. Hope, he had discovered, was more dangerous than anger, because hope made you vulnerable to disappointment, and disappointment in his position could be fatal. But when he arrived at St. Michael's Plantation and began his work managing inventory and maintaining account books, Marcus encountered something he had not anticipated. One of the nuns, the youngest one, the one called Sister Mary Catherine, looked at him differently than others did. Not with pity, which he despised, and not with the guilt-stricken avoidance that some religious people exhibited around enslaved workers, but with something closer to curiosity, as if she were trying to reconcile what she had been taught about people like him with what she was actually observing. Marcus recognized that curiosity as dangerous, both to her and to himself, because curiosity led to questions, and questions led to conversations, and conversations between a nun and an enslaved man could only end one way, with someone getting hurt. The first sin was conversation. The rule of the Sacred Heart was absolute and unambiguous. Nuns were forbidden from speaking directly to enslaved men except to give instructions, and even then, such communication should be conducted through an intermediary whenever possible, to protect both the sister's virtue and prevent any familiarity that might undermine the natural order of authority. The Mother Superior had been explicit in her warnings before they departed for St. Michael's. Close proximity to plantation workers created spiritual dangers that sheltered convent life did not. The sisters must maintain constant vigilance against the corrupting influence of informal interaction, must remember that their role was to administer God's property, not to form personal connections with those who labored under their supervision. But St. Michael's Plantation, isolated from the watchful eyes of the Mother Superior and the rigid protocols of convent life, operated with a dangerous informality that Sister Mary Catherine justified to herself as practical necessity. The other nuns managed their domains with varying degrees of strictness, but the plantation office where Catherine worked each afternoon existed in a strange bubble of quiet efficiency. Marcus kept the account books in a corner desk, his handwriting neater than her own, his calculations accurate to the penny, his organizational system more logical than anything she had been taught in the convent's brief training sessions. At first, their interactions followed propriety with careful precision. Catherine would leave written instructions on his desk each morning, specifying which records needed updating, which correspondence required filing, which inventory lists needed reconciliation with actual supplies. Marcus would complete the work before noon, leaving the finished documents on her desk with no commentary, no questions, no acknowledgement beyond the completed tasks themselves. They existed in the same space like two ghosts, occupying parallel dimensions, aware of each other but never truly intersecting. This arrangement persisted through April and into May, sustainable because neither of them challenged its boundaries. Catherine told herself she was following protocol, maintaining appropriate distance, fulfilling her duties without compromising her vows. Marcus, for his part, had learned through brutal experience that invisibility was survival, that drawing attention to himself invited danger, regardless of whether that attention was positive or negative. But on May 23rd, something changed. Catherine had been reviewing the cotton weight records from the previous week's harvest when she noticed a discrepancy. Several bales recorded at weights that seemed inconsistent with the field yields. She spent an hour checking and rechecking the numbers, growing increasingly frustrated because the error might indicate theft by workers, inaccurate scales, or simply her own incompetence at mathematics. She was preparing to report the discrepancy to Sister Beatrice when she noticed a note in the margin of Marcus's ledger, written in his precise hand. Weights corrected for moisture content. See adjusted figures below. He had already identified the problem, calculated the correct weights accounting for moisture loss during storage, and reconciled the apparent discrepancy before she had even noticed it existed. More than that, he had anticipated questions and provided documentation to support his calculations, showing a level of initiative and competence that went far beyond what she expected from someone in his position. Catherine stood in the office holding his ledger, staring at those marginal notes, and felt something crack in the careful wall she had built between them. He was not invisible. He was not merely property performing assigned tasks. He was intelligent, observant, capable of independent thought and problem-solving, and he had been helping her manage the plantation records more competently than she could have managed them alone. She found him that afternoon in the supply shed, cataloging recently delivered equipment. Protocol dictated she should leave a written note of acknowledgement or say nothing at all. Instead, she broke 4 years of conditioning with a single sentence. "Thank you for catching the error in the cotton weights. Your notation was clearer than anything I learned in training." Marcus looked up from his work, surprise flickering across his face before he carefully masked it with the neutral expression he wore like armor. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Catherine wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, if acknowledging his competence had somehow violated a boundary neither of them could afford to cross. Then Marcus spoke, his voice careful and measured. "You are welcome, sister. The scales sometimes give false readings when humidity is high. I learned to account for it at my previous position. It was a simple exchange, professional and appropriate, exactly the kind of brief communication the rules permitted when necessity demanded it. But something in that moment shifted between them, an acknowledgement that they were both thinking beings capable of mutual respect, and that recognition, however small, was the first step towards something neither of them could have predicted, and neither would be able to stop. The letters he was never meant to read. Sister Mary Catherine maintained weekly correspondence with her younger sister Marianne, who lived in Charleston, with their elderly father in a house that grew emptier with each passing year. The letters served multiple purposes, maintaining family connection across the miles that separated them, providing Catherine an outlet for thoughts she could share with no one else at St. Michael's, and preserving some semblance of the person she had been before taking vows, before becoming Sister Mary Catherine, when she was simply Catherine Bellamy with dreams and doubts and questions that had no easy answers. These letters, written late at night after the other nuns had retired, filled with observations about plantation life that ranged from mundane details about Louisiana heat and mosquitoes to more complex ruminations about faith and purpose. She complained about the monotony of account books, described the strange beauty of the river at sunset, and occasionally, in moments of unguarded honesty, confessed her growing unease with the contradiction of running a plantation, worked by enslaved people, while claiming to serve a God who preached universal human dignity. Catherine kept these letters in her desk drawer until they could be posted, accumulating sometimes 2 or 3 before an opportunity arose to send them via the monthly supply wagon that traveled between St. Michael's and New Orleans. She never imagined that anyone else would see them, never considered that the drawer where she stored them was in a desk that Marcus cleaned each evening after she returned to the main house, never anticipated that he would be curious enough about the woman who treated him with slightly more humanity than most white people had in years to actually read her private correspondence. But Marcus did read them, not out of malice or calculation, but from a desperate hunger to understand the mind of someone who occupied a position of power over him, yet seemed genuinely troubled by that power. The first letter he read accidentally, left partially visible in the drawer one evening in early June. The opening lines caught his attention. "I wonder sometimes whether I chose God or merely chose escape from a future I feared. Is there virtue in vows taken from cowardice rather than conviction?" The vulnerability in those words, the admission of doubt from someone who was supposed to embody certainty, intrigued him enough to read further. He discovered in Catherine's letters to her sister a portrait of loneliness, spiritual crisis, and moral questioning that she showed to no one at the plantation. She wrote about feeling trapped between the person she had been and the person her vows demanded she become, about doubting whether she had a genuine calling or had simply traded one form of imprisonment for another, about watching enslaved people work the fields and wondering how she would explain to God her participation in their suffering. Reading these letters was dangerous, potentially fatal if discovered. But Marcus, who had spent years being treated as if he had no interior life, no thoughts worth hearing, no perspective worth considering, found in Catherine's words evidence that at least one white person, one nun, one owner, was asking the same questions he had been asking all his life. How do good people participate in evil systems? Where is God in the face of institutional cruelty? Can those who benefit from injustice ever truly oppose it? In late June, Marcus did something unthinkable, something that could get him whipped or sold or killed, depending on how it was received. He wrote a response, not to send to Marianne, but to leave in Catherine's drawer where she would find it, a single page written in his careful script, addressing the theological and philosophical questions she had posed to her sister. He wrote about faith tested by suffering, about finding dignity in circumstances designed to strip dignity away, about whether God heard the prayers of people whom society deemed property rather than persons. He wrote, "You ask your sister if vows taken from fear have merit. Perhaps the question is not why we make choices, but what we do with them afterward. I was born into circumstances I did not choose, sold 3 times to men I did not select, forced into labor I cannot refuse. Yet each day I choose whether to let those circumstances destroy the person I am inside, or to preserve something they cannot touch regardless of how they use my body. Your vows may have begun in fear, sister, but fear can be transformed into purpose if you allow it. The question is not whether you entered the convent as an escape, but whether you will leave it as someone who finally found what she was escaping toward." He left the letter in her drawer and walked away, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, knowing he had crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. The other nuns who suspected nothing. The 5 nuns who lived with Catherine at St. Michael's operated with the collective blindness of people who could not conceive of sin where they had been trained to see only virtue. Each woman had constructed her own careful routine, her own domain of control within the plantation's operations, and these routines created a pattern of life that was both structured and surprisingly isolating despite their shared living quarters. Sister Beatrice, at 42, the eldest among them, managed the household accounts with an obsession that bordered on compulsion. She spent hours each day reviewing expenditures, calculating profit margins, and preparing the quarterly reports that would be scrutinized by diocese auditors. Her world consisted entirely of numbers, and she evaluated success or failure purely through financial metrics. Whether the enslaved workers were treated humanely mattered to her only insofar as it affected productivity and replacement costs. Sister Agnes oversaw the kitchen and household staff with the efficiency of a military commander. She had developed a system of meal preparation that ran with clockwork precision, each enslaved cook and servant knowing exactly what was expected at what time, with deviations from routine met with sharp reprimands. She prided herself on the smooth operation of domestic affairs, viewing any disruption as a personal failure. Sister Teresa supervised the field workers, a role that required her to spend long hours outdoors in conditions that left her perpetually sunburned and exhausted. She approached the work with detached professionalism, treating the enslaved workers as one might treat farm equipment that required maintenance but deserved no emotional investment. She could recite cotton yields and planting schedules with perfect accuracy, but could not have told you the names of half the people who worked under her supervision. Sister Margaret handled medical care, both for the nuns and the plantation workers, operating a small infirmary where she treated everything from minor cuts to serious illnesses with the limited supplies and knowledge available. She was perhaps the most compassionate of the group, genuinely troubled when people suffered, but her compassion existed within carefully maintained boundaries that never questioned the system itself. Sister Louise led their daily prayers and maintained the small chapel they had established in one room of the overseer's house. She was the most devout among them, the most convinced of their mission's righteousness, and the least interested in the practical operations of the plantation. She existed in a state of almost constant prayer, seeking divine guidance for their work while remaining willfully ignorant of what that work actually entailed. These 5 women, each consumed with her assigned duties, created an environment where Catherine's growing attachment to Marcus could develop unnoticed. They saw her spending hours in the office but assumed she was simply diligent. They noticed her distraction during evening prayers but attributed it to exhaustion. They observed her lingering near the supply shed, but thought nothing of it because their own routines had trained them to see only what fit their expectations. Or perhaps they noticed, but chose not to see, because acknowledging what was happening between Catherine and Marcus would require confronting questions about their own complicity in a system that made some people property and others owners. Ignorance, whether genuine or performed, protected them from that confrontation. The Theology of Forbidden Love. Their conversations, conducted in whispers during the brief moments when others were occupied elsewhere, ranged across territory that would have scandalized the church and endangered both their lives. What began as exchanges about plantation management evolved into discussions that challenged every assumption Catherine had been taught about faith, morality, and the social order that governed their world. Marcus challenged Catherine's assumptions with arguments drawn from Scripture and brutal personal experience. He asked her to reconcile the Exodus narrative, where God liberated the enslaved Israelites from Egyptian bondage, with a church that profited from the enslavement of Africans. He quoted Paul's letter to Philemon, asking why, if the apostle urged the return of an escaped slave, modern Christians interpreted that as endorsement of slavery, rather than as Paul navigating an unjust system he lacked power to change. Catherine, trained in convent theology that emphasized obedience and tradition, found herself defending positions she no longer believed. She repeated the church's teaching that slavery was unfortunate, but not inherently sinful, if slaves were treated with Christian charity. But the words felt hollow, even as she spoke them. How could an institution built on treating humans as property ever be administered with charity? They debated the nature of sin itself. Was greater sin found in violating social conventions that maintained unjust systems, or in participating in those systems while claiming moral authority? Catherine had taken vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. But what did those vows mean when the institution she served violated every principle of human dignity those vows supposedly represented? Marcus shared with Catherine the reality of his existence, the calculations required to survive as property. How he had learned to make himself simultaneously useful enough to keep and invisible enough to avoid attention. How he monitored the moods of white people, the way sailors monitored weather, knowing that sudden shifts could be fatal. How he had taught himself to separate his essential self from his body, to preserve something internal that could not be bought or sold, regardless of what happened to his physical form. Catherine, in turn, shared with Marcus the doubts she had harbored since entering the convent. She confessed that she had taken vows not from genuine calling, but from desperation, choosing the safety of God's bride over the vulnerability of being any mortal man's wife. She admitted that she had spent 4 years trying to silence the voice inside her that questioned whether submission to institutional authority could substitute for authentic faith. What emerged from these conversations was something neither of them had anticipated: genuine intimacy built on mutual recognition of shared humanity. Marcus saw in Catherine someone struggling to reconcile inherited beliefs with emerging conscience. Catherine saw in Marcus an intellect and moral clarity that surpassed most educated men she had known, slave or free. They were playing with fire and both knew it. But the alternative, returning to the silence and isolation that had defined their lives before finding each other, had become unthinkable. The distance between appropriate conversation and forbidden connection was shorter than either had imagined, and they had already crossed it. The night, Everything changed. August 17, 1838, brought a storm that announced itself hours before arrival, the sky turning a sickly yellow-green that made even the most experienced plantation workers nervous. By late afternoon, wind had begun tearing through the live oaks, sending Spanish moss flying like gray ghosts across the fields. The barometric pressure dropped so suddenly that several people complained of headaches and nausea, nature's warning that something violent approached. The nuns scrambled to secure their living quarters as the first drops of rain became a deluge that knocked out windows and tore shingles from the roof. Sister Beatrice shouted instructions about moving account books to higher ground. Sister Agnes directed the securing of food stores. Sister Teresa coordinated with field workers to protect equipment and livestock. In the chaos, Catherine and Marcus found themselves together in the office, ostensibly protecting the most important plantation records from water damage. The storm outside mirrored something building between them that could no longer be contained by propriety or fear. Rain hammered the roof with such violence that conversation became impossible. But they worked side by side, moving ledgers and documents to shelves away from the leaking windows, their movements synchronized through weeks of working in proximity, their hands occasionally touching as they reached for the same items. Lightning struck close enough to shake the building, the thunder simultaneous and deafening. In the flash of illumination, Catherine saw Marcus's face, saw in his eyes something that matched what she felt building inside herself, a longing that transcended the careful boundaries they had maintained. The storm had stripped away the pretense, the performance, the careful distance that had allowed them to justify their conversations as appropriate professional interaction. When the lightning struck again and the office plunged into darkness, when Catherine stumbled and Marcus caught her, when she turned in his arms and neither of them pulled away. What happened next was perhaps inevitable, or perhaps it was a choice they both made, knowing the consequences would be catastrophic, but choosing connection over safety, choosing to affirm their humanity in the only way that seemed genuine in that moment. Marcus touched Catherine's face with a gentleness that contradicted every brutal interaction he had experienced with white people who owned him. Catherine pulled him closer with a hunger that surprised her, having spent 4 years suppressing every physical desire in service of vows she no longer believed reflected genuine devotion. The storm raged around them, providing cover for a transgression that violated every law, every social convention, every religious doctrine that governed their world. What occurred in that office during the storm was brief, desperate, and transformative. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, both terrified and exhilarated, Catherine understood that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. She had broken her vows in the most literal and irreversible way possible. She had committed a sin that, if discovered, would destroy her and likely get Marcus killed. But she felt more alive, more authentically herself, than she had in years. The pregnancy that could not be hidden. By late September, Catherine understood what her body was telling her with increasing insistence. The morning nausea she initially attributed to spoiled food persisted beyond what could be explained by illness. Her monthly courses, usually regular despite the Louisiana heat, failed to arrive for the second consecutive month. Her breast became tender, her fatigue overwhelming, and her emotions swung between terror and a strange, illicit joy she could not suppress. She was carrying Marcus's child, a fact that once revealed would destroy everything. The other nuns, still oblivious despite her growing anxiety, noticed only that Catherine had been feeling ill. Sister Margaret offered herbal remedies for what she diagnosed as digestive troubles brought on by the climate. Sister Agnes adjusted Catherine's diet, providing blander foods that might settle her stomach. Their genuine concern made Catherine's deception even more painful, each kindness a reminder of the betrayal they would eventually discover. Catherine and Marcus had been careful since the night of the storm, maintaining appropriate distance during daylight hours, never allowing themselves to be alone together where observation was possible. But the damage was done, and Catherine's body would soon provide evidence that no amount of careful behavior could conceal. She had perhaps 2 more months before the physical changes became impossible to hide. Beneath her habit, perhaps 3 if she was fortunate. But fortune had not been her companion recently. The terror of her situation was matched only by emotions she knew she should not feel. When she was alone at night, Catherine would place her hand on her still flat stomach and feel wonder at the life growing there. This child, conceived in violation of every vow she had taken, represented something genuine in a life built on performance and pretense. She carried physical proof of the only authentic choice she had made since entering the convent, and despite the catastrophic consequences that awaited, she could not bring herself to regret what had happened. Marcus, when she finally found the courage to tell him in a whispered conversation while the other nuns attended evening prayers, responded with a mixture of fear and determination that surprised her. His first thought was not for himself, but for her safety and the child's. Within days he had begun formulating plans for their escape, though both of them understood that running was nearly impossible. Catherine's habit made her identifiable anywhere in the South. Marcus would be hunted as escaped property, with rewards posted and slave patrols organized. Traveling together would draw immediate attention from every checkpoint, every suspicious innkeeper, every person who had been trained to see mixed-race couples as evidence of crime. The few free black people who existed in Louisiana carried papers documenting their status, papers that Marcus did not have and could not obtain without exposing their situation. They needed help, resources, and time. 3 things they did not have. Catherine's pregnancy would become visible within months, Marcus's absence would be noticed immediately, and the moment anyone suspected the truth, both of them would face consequences that ranged from imprisonment to execution. The convent's secret ledger. What Catherine discovered while searching the office for documents they might need for their escape would fundamentally alter her understanding of the institution she had served. She had been looking for property deeds, maps, anything that might help them plan a route north, when she noticed something odd about the Mother Superior's desk during one of her rare, unsupervised moments in mid-October. The drawer appeared shallower than the desk's external dimensions suggested. Catherine, desperate enough to take risks she would never have considered months earlier, removed the drawer completely and discovered a false bottom. Hidden beneath it was a second ledger, smaller than the Plantation's official account books, but bound in the same leather, maintained in the same careful script that recorded St. Michael's operations. This secret ledger recorded transactions that would never appear in documents reviewed by diocese auditors. It detailed a network of human commerce that extended across the South, with convents in Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia participating in an interconnected system of buying, selling, and transferring enslaved people between church properties. The entries dated back decades, suggesting this was not aberrant behavior by a single corrupt official, but institutional practice maintained across administrations. Some entries recorded straightforward sales. Enslaved workers purchased at one location and sold at another, when their labor was no longer needed, or when cash flow required liquidation of assets. The profit margins were calculated with the same precision Sister Beatrice applied to cotton sales, human beings converted to numbers that represented return on investment for God's work. Other entries were more disturbing. Enslaved people designated as problematic were transferred between properties with increasing frequency until they disappeared from the records entirely, their final dispositions noted only as resolved or disposed of per bishop's instruction. Catherine found 7 such entries at St. Michael's alone over the past decade, including one from just 2 years earlier involving a woman named Sarah, who had been accused of poisoning an overseer's food. The ledger also revealed that the separation of enslaved families was not accidental collateral damage but deliberate policy. Children were sold away from parents once they reached working age, maximizing profit by eliminating unproductive members while retaining valuable laborers. Husbands and wives were separated when operational needs dictated, with no consideration given to relationships the church officially recognized as sacred among its white members, but treated as irrelevant among the enslaved. Catherine sat in the office holding this ledger, feeling physically ill as she comprehended the scope of institutional corruption. The church she had devoted her life to was not merely complicit in slavery's evils, but actively profiting from its cruelest practices. Every hospital built, every school opened, every missionary sent to convert distant populations was funded in part by the calculated destruction of enslaved families and the disposal of inconvenient human beings. The vow of poverty that nuns took apparently did not extend to the institution itself, which had accumulated wealth through mechanisms that would have scandalized the Christ whose teachings supposedly guided their actions. Catherine understood in that moment that her personal transgression, her violation of chastity vows, was microscopic compared to the institutional sin documented in these pages, the alliance with unlikely helpers. Marcus had connections Catherine knew nothing about, an underground network invisible to white eyes yet essential to the survival and sanity of enslaved people across Louisiana. These connections operated through careful signals, through songs whose lyrics carried dual meanings, through messages passed between plantations by workers sent on errands, through coded conversations that sounded innocuous to those not trained to hear them. When Marcus reached out to this network for help in late October, he did so with extreme caution, knowing that desperation made people vulnerable to betrayal. Rewards for escaped slaves could be substantial enough to tempt even those who ordinarily helped fugitives, and Marcus's situation was complicated by the involvement of a white woman, a nun no less, whose flight would draw attention far beyond what a single escaped slave might generate. 2 men responded to his carefully worded inquiries. The first was Solomon, an enslaved blacksmith from a neighboring plantation, whose owner occasionally loaned him out to other properties for specialized metal work. Solomon had attempted escape twice, once making it as far as Tennessee before being captured and returned, the second time betrayed by someone he trusted before even leaving Louisiana. His failures had taught him what not to do, had shown him the weaknesses in various escape routes, had given him hard-earned knowledge about which white people could be bribed and which were incorruptible in their commitment to maintaining slavery's architecture. The second man was Jean-Baptiste Mercier, a free person of color who operated a general store in New Orleans' Treme neighborhood. Jean-Baptiste occupied a precarious position in Louisiana's racial hierarchy, possessing freedom but constantly aware of how tenuous that freedom was, how easily it could be stripped away by accusation or legal manipulation. He had helped dozens of escaped slaves find passage north over the years, motivated partly by conscience and partly by the substantial fees he charged for his services. Together, these 3 men began planning something far more audacious than Catherine and Marcus had initially conceived. Not just the escape of 2 people, but the liberation of all 31 enslaved workers at St. Michael's Plantation. The idea was born from Solomon's observation that small-scale escapes drew intense pursuit, but larger disruptions created confusion that might provide cover for multiple people to disappear in different directions before coordinated pursuit could be organized. Jean-Baptiste could arrange passage north for Catherine and Marcus using his established contacts with sympathetic ship captains and conductors on what was beginning to be called the Underground Railroad. But doing so required money, more than Catherine had access to in the plantation's ordinary accounts. They would need to access the plantation's safe, where larger sums were kept for major purchases and emergency expenses. The planning sessions occurred in stolen moments, in whispered conversations during the brief windows when all 3 men could be in proximity without arousing suspicion. Each meeting refined the plan, identified obstacles, calculated risks. They were plotting not just escape, but revolution, however small and localized, and the penalty for failure would be death. The Mother Superior's unexpected visit. In early November, a letter arrived from New Orleans bearing the Mother Superior's seal, and news that made Catherine's blood run cold. Mother Superior Agatha would be conducting an inspection of St. Michael's Plantation in 3 weeks, arriving November 28th and staying through December the 1st. She would be accompanied by the bishop himself, who wished to personally review the operation and determine whether the experiment of having nuns manage plantation operations should be expanded to other church properties. The announcement sent immediate panic through Catherine, whose pregnancy was now approaching 4 months. The changes in her body had become difficult to conceal beneath the loose folds of her habit, and while the other nuns remained oblivious, the Mother Superior's experienced eye would likely notice what others had missed. An inspection meant close quarters, shared meals, evening prayers conducted with the scrutiny of someone evaluating not just operational efficiency, but spiritual discipline. Catherine met with Marcus that evening in the supply shed, their first extended conversation in weeks given the increased caution her condition demanded. The news changed everything about their timeline. They had been planning to wait until spring, when travel conditions would improve and Catherine's pregnancy would be advanced enough that birthing the child during flight would not be immediate concern. Now they had 3 weeks, perhaps less, before discovery became inevitable. Marcus saw opportunity where Catherine saw only catastrophe. The Mother Superior's visit would bring chaos to the plantation's normal routine. Additional supplies would be ordered, buildings would be cleaned and repaired, everyone would be distracted by preparation. More importantly, the presence of church officials meant the plantation's safe would be opened multiple times for accounting reviews, giving them unprecedented opportunity to learn its contents and combination. He proposed they move their escape to coincide with the Mother Superior's arrival, using the disruption of the visit itself as cover. If they could create additional chaos during the inspection, perhaps through a carefully staged accident or fire, they might escape in the confusion, while church authorities were too busy managing immediate crisis to organize pursuit. The plan terrified Catherine because it compressed their timeline dramatically and increased the stakes beyond what she had imagined. But Marcus was right that waiting meant certain discovery, and discovery meant death for him and imprisonment for her, their child born in disgrace and likely taken away immediately to protect the church's reputation. They had 3 weeks to finalize every detail, to coordinate with Solomon and Jean-Baptiste, to identify the optimal moment for creating sufficient chaos to mask their flight. 3 weeks to prepare for a night that would either bring them freedom or end in catastrophe that would destroy everyone involved. Catherine returned to the main house that evening and participated in evening prayers with the other nuns, reciting familiar words that had lost all meaning, performing devotion she no longer felt, maintaining the facade that grew more difficult with each passing day. Sister Louise led them in prayers of thanksgiving for their mission's success, for the Mother Superior's upcoming visit, for the bishop's continued support of their work. Catherine bowed her head and prayed for something else entirely, for courage, for luck, for the strength to do what needed to be done. The secret that nearly unraveled everything. Sister Teresa, the quietest of the nuns and the one Catherine had least suspected of observation, appeared at Catherine's door late one evening in mid-November, with an expression that made Catherine's blood run cold. It was nearly midnight, long past the hour when any of them should have been awake, and Teresa's presence at Catherine's private quarters violated their usual protocols about respecting each other's limited privacy. Catherine opened the door with her heart hammering, certain that discovery had come, that somehow Teresa had learned about Marcus, about the pregnancy, about their escape plans. Teresa slipped inside quickly and closed the door behind her, her face carrying an expression Catherine had never seen before, something between sympathy and resolve. "I need to speak with you about something that cannot wait until morning," Teresa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have been watching you for weeks now, Sister Catherine. I have seen things that concern me greatly." Catherine felt the world narrow to that small room, to Teresa's words, to the certainty that everything was about to collapse. She considered denying whatever accusation was coming, but the exhaustion of constant deception had worn away her capacity for additional lies. "What have you seen?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Teresa studied her for a long moment before responding. "I have seen you spending time with the slave Marcus in ways that exceed professional necessity. I have seen the way you look at him when you think no one is observing. I have seen changes in your body that you have tried to hide beneath your habit." She paused, letting the implications settle between them. "I understand what is happening, Sister Catherine. Perhaps I understand better than you realize." Catherine waited for the denunciation, for Teresa to declare her intention to report everything to the Mother Superior. Instead, Teresa said something Catherine never anticipated. "I was you once, before I took my vows. I loved a man my family deemed unsuitable, a merchant's son without property or prospects. I chose God over love because I was a coward, because I lacked the courage to defy my family and society's expectations. I have spent 15 years regretting that choice, wondering what my life might have been if I had chosen differently." The confession hung in the air between them, Teresa's carefully maintained facade of devotion cracking to reveal a woman who had spent years nursing her own quiet heartbreak. "I will not make your mistake for you," Teresa continued. "I will not report what I have seen, but neither can I actively help you escape. My vows may have been taken from fear, but they are still vows, and I lack the courage to break them even now." What Teresa could offer was silence and small acts of complicity that carried their own risk. She would create diversions when needed, would ensure the other nuns remained occupied during critical moments, would ask no questions about activities she chose not to witness. It was limited help, but it might mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. The plan that required perfect timing. The escape strategy they devised was elaborate, requiring the precise coordination of multiple simultaneous actions and the cooperation of people who had every reason to distrust each other. Marcus, Solomon, and Jean-Baptiste met 3 times in the weeks before the Mother Superior's arrival, each meeting refining details and identifying potential failure points in a plan that had dozens of ways to collapse. The timing would be critical. November 28th, the night before Mother Superior Agatha's actual inspection, when the plantation would be in a state of heightened preparation, but before the visitors had arrived to provide direct oversight. The other nuns would be distracted with final arrangements, the enslaved workers exhausted from extra labor preparing the grounds, everyone's attention fragmented across competing demands. At precisely 10 o'clock that evening, Solomon would set fire to the cotton storage barn at the eastern edge of the plantation, far enough from living quarters to avoid casualties, but significant enough to create genuine emergency. The barn contained approximately 40 bales of ginned cotton awaiting transport, representing substantial value that would require immediate response to salvage. During the chaos of fighting the fire, Catherine would access the plantation's safe using the combination she had memorized from watching Sister Beatrice during a recent accounting session. She would take enough money to fund their journey north, but not so much that the theft would be immediately obvious. The goal was to steal perhaps half the cash on hand, an amount that might initially be attributed to accounting error or confusion during the emergency. Marcus and the other enslaved workers would use the fire as cover to disappear into the swamp that bordered the plantation's western boundary. Jean-Baptiste would be waiting 3 miles downstream with a flatboat capable of transporting multiple people, having bribed the one reliable river patrol officer who worked that section on Thursday nights. Catherine would claim she was overcome by smoke during the fire response and became disoriented, wandering away from the main buildings in confusion. By the time anyone realized she was missing, she would be with Marcus in the swamp, and the searchers would waste crucial hours looking for her near the fire site rather than realizing she had fled intentionally. The other enslaved workers who escaped would scatter in multiple directions, some heading north with Jean-Baptiste's help, others disappearing into New Orleans where free black communities might provide temporary shelter, still others attempting to reach family members on distant plantations. The multiplicity of targets would fragment pursuit, preventing the focused manhunt that a single escape would generate. It was a plan built on hope and desperation in equal measure, dependent on fire spreading at the correct rate, on guards and nuns responding predictably, on weather conditions cooperating, on Jean-Baptiste arriving at the rendezvous point despite having no certain communication about whether the plan was proceeding. 1,000 variables beyond their control, any one of which could transform their bid for freedom into catastrophe. But it was the only plan they had, and November 28th was approaching with inexorable speed, bringing with it either liberation or destruction, salvation or death. The fire that lit the sky. November 28, 1838, began with unseasonable cold, a sharp wind from the north that made the enslaved workers shiver in their thin clothing, and should have warned everyone that conditions were not ideal for controlled fire. The day proceeded with the controlled chaos of preparation for important visitors. Sister Beatrice reviewed accounts obsessively. Sister Agnes directed elaborate meal preparations. Sister Margaret organized the infirmary for inspection, and Catherine performed her duties with mechanical efficiency, while terror churned in her stomach. As evening approached and the temperature continued dropping, Catherine found herself questioning whether they should postpone, whether the weather made the plan too dangerous. But postponement meant certain discovery when the Mother Superior arrived tomorrow and noticed what everyone else had somehow missed. They were committed now, past the point where retreat was possible. At 10 o'clock, Solomon approached the cotton barn with a shuttered lantern and a bundle of oil-soaked rags. The plan called for a controlled burn that would create sufficient emergency to distract everyone without endangering lives. But the unseasonable wind transformed careful planning into catastrophe within minutes. The flames that Solomon lit spread faster than anyone anticipated, jumping from the cotton barn to the adjacent equipment shed before he could even retreat to safety. The wind carried embers across the compound, igniting dry grass and wooden structures with terrifying speed, transforming their carefully planned diversion into a genuine firestorm that threatened to consume the entire plantation. Catherine was in the main house when she heard the first shouts of alarm. She ran to her room, grabbed the small bag she had hidden containing her few personal possessions and her father's letters, then moved toward the office where the safe waited. But the fire had spread so rapidly that chaos prevented the systematic response they had anticipated. Nuns and enslaved workers alike fought the flames with desperate improvisation, forming bucket brigades from the well, beating at sparks with blankets, trying to create fire breaks by tearing down structures before the flames could reach them. The office itself filled with smoke as wind drove the fire closer to the main buildings. Catherine worked the safe's combination with shaking hands, the heat growing intense enough that she wondered if she would escape before the building caught fire. The safe opened finally, revealing stacks of currency and documents she had no time to examine. She grabbed approximately half the bills, stuffing them into her bag, then fled toward the predetermined meeting point in the swamp. Behind her, St. Michael's Plantation burned with an intensity that lit the night sky for miles. The fire they had intended as distraction had become disaster, destroying not just the cotton barn, but 5 slave cabins, the equipment shed, the overseer's cabin, and threatening the main house itself. People who should have been searching for escaped workers were instead fighting for survival, and in that chaos, Catherine ran toward an uncertain future. The hunt that followed. By dawn on November 29th, the fire had been contained, but the damage was catastrophic. The cotton barn was completely destroyed, along with the approximately 40 bales of ginned cotton it contained, representing a loss of nearly $3,000 in market value. 5 slave cabins had burned to their foundations, the equipment shed was gone, and the overseer's cabin was damaged beyond repair. Worse, from the church's perspective, 2 nuns had sustained injuries during the firefighting efforts. Sister Agnes suffering severe burns to her hands, and Sister Margaret overcome by smoke inhalation. Mother Superior Agatha arrived at mid-morning to find organized chaos. The fire was out, but assessment of damage was ongoing. Injured workers were being treated in the makeshift infirmary, and the plantation's operations had ground to a halt. Her first concern was the welfare of her nuns, her second the plantation's financial losses, and only as the initial crisis subsided did anyone notice that Sister Catherine was missing. When Catherine failed to appear for morning prayers, Sister Beatrice had initially assumed she was assisting with fire cleanup. When she did not appear for breakfast, concern began to mount. A search of her room revealed that some of her personal possessions were gone, and when Sister Beatrice finally thought to check the plantation safe, she discovered the theft that confirmed everyone's worst fears. Catherine had not been overcome by smoke and wandered off in confusion. She had stolen a significant sum and fled intentionally. But the discovery that truly scandalized the Mother Superior came when she reviewed the roster of enslaved workers and discovered that 3 men were also missing. Marcus, the literate slave who kept plantation records. Solomon, borrowed from a neighboring plantation for metalwork. And Daniel, one of the younger field workers. The implications were immediate and horrifying. A nun had not simply stolen money and fled. She had apparently run off with enslaved men, suggesting a moral corruption so profound that it threatened the church's entire mission in Louisiana. The Mother Superior understood immediately that this scandal needed to be managed with extreme discretion, but managing it required recovering Catherine before word spread beyond the plantation's boundaries. Within hours, slave patrols were organized with detailed descriptions of all 4 fugitives. Bounties were posted, neighboring plantations were notified, and roads leading north were monitored. The hunt was complicated by the fire's timing, which meant investigators could not determine precisely when the fugitives had fled or how much head start they had gained. The church offered substantial rewards. $500 for the return of the 3 enslaved men, alive and unharmed, and an unstated but understood promise of discretion for anyone who could return Sister Catherine without generating public scandal. But slave catchers cared more about the $500 than the church's reputation, and word of the escape began spreading across Louisiana, despite the Mother Superior's efforts to contain it. 4 fugitives were loose in Louisiana, hunted by professionals who understood that runaways rarely made it more than 50 miles before being captured. The weeks in hiding. Catherine, Marcus, and Solomon spent 3 weeks hiding in the swamps and forests between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, moving only at night, surviving on what food they could steal or forage from abandoned homesteads, and waiting desperately for Jean-Baptiste to make contact with news about their next move north. Daniel had been separated from them during the fire's chaos, cut off by flames before reaching the rendezvous point, and they had no way of knowing whether he had escaped independently or been captured. The swamp was simultaneously shelter and torment. Dense vegetation provided concealment from searchers, but also harbored mosquitoes that swarmed in clouds, snakes that moved through water with sinuous menace, and alligators that watched them with prehistoric patience. They slept during daylight hours when pursuit was most active, taking turns keeping watch, never allowing all three to sleep simultaneously, because exhaustion made people careless, and carelessness meant capture. During those weeks, Catherine experienced what life was like for the people she had once owned. The constant terror of discovery, the gnawing hunger when food was scarce, the exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue to become existential weariness, with the struggle for survival. She learned to move through underbrush without sound, to identify which berries were edible and which would cause illness, to interpret the calls of birds and determine whether they signaled approaching danger. Marcus and Solomon taught her things her sheltered life had never required: how to treat infected wounds with poultices made from swamp vegetation, how to start fires using friction when matches were unavailable, how to read the night sky for direction when traveling without compass or map. In the intimate proximity of their hiding spots, the social distances that had defined their relationships dissolved entirely, leaving only three people fighting for freedom against a system designed to ensure some people would never be free. Catherine's pregnancy advanced through these weeks, her body changing in ways she could not hide from her companions. Marcus watched over her with an attentiveness that bordered on obsessive, rationing food to ensure she ate adequately, finding softer ground for her to rest, taking longer watches so she could sleep more. Solomon, initially suspicious of their relationship and resentful of the attention it demanded, gradually softened as he witnessed the genuine affection between them. They learned Jean-Baptiste's fate in mid-December, when Solomon risked venturing to the edge of a settlement and overheard conversations that chilled him. Jean-Baptiste had been arrested, charged with aiding escaped slaves, and was being held pending trial. His arrest meant their planned route north was compromised, their expected help unavailable, and their resources limited to whatever money Catherine had stolen, which was substantial, but not infinite. They needed a new plan, new contacts, new hope. But after 3 weeks of hiding, with winter settling over Louisiana and Catherine's pregnancy becoming more obvious daily, their options were narrowing toward a single, desperate choice: surrender or push forward into uncertainty with no clear path to freedom. The betrayal they never saw coming. Desperate circumstances make people vulnerable to hope, and hope makes people careless in ways that survival cannot afford. When a contact of Solomon's finally reached them in mid-December with news that he had secured passage on a ship heading to Philadelphia, they wanted so badly to believe in salvation that they ignored the warning signs that should have triggered suspicion. The contact was a man named Thomas Wright, supposedly a free black carpenter who occasionally helped escaped slaves in exchange for payment. Wright brought word that Jean-Baptiste had given him their names before his arrest, had arranged for Wright to complete the transportation he could no longer provide. A ship captain named Harrison operated a merchant vessel that made regular runs between New Orleans and Philadelphia, and for $500, he would allow 3 passengers to hide in his cargo hold during the voyage north. The price was higher than Jean-Baptiste had quoted, but Wright explained that Harrison had become more cautious after several high-profile captures of fugitives, that the risk premium had increased, that $500 was actually a bargain considering the danger involved. The explanation was plausible, the urgency compelling, and Catherine had the money. They agreed to meet Wright at the New Orleans docks on December 18th, 2 hours before Harrison's ship was scheduled to depart. But something in Wright's manner troubled Marcus, a nervousness that seemed excessive even given the circumstances, a tendency to avoid direct eye contact, a speed of speech that suggested rehearsed lies rather than genuine information. Marcus had survived multiple owners by learning to read the subtle signs of deception, by trusting instincts honed through brutal experience with white people and black people alike who would betray others for profit or safety. The night before the scheduled meeting, Marcus insisted they observe the docks from a distance before approaching. Catherine protested that caution was making them paranoid, that they needed to trust someone, or they would never escape Louisiana. But Marcus was adamant, his survival instincts overriding their desperate desire for resolution. From their vantage point in a warehouse overlooking the docks, they watched as Wright arrived, early on December 18th, and immediately approached two white men whose bearing and weapons identified them as slave catchers. The conversation was animated, Wright gesturing toward the ship where he had told them to meet, the slave catchers nodding and taking positions that would allow them to surround anyone approaching the gangplank. Wright had sold them out, trading information about their location for whatever reward the slave catchers offered. Whether he had planned betrayal from the beginning, or whether Jean-Baptiste had genuinely trusted him and Wright had succumbed to temptation, they would never know. What mattered was that the trap was set, and only Marcus's wariness had prevented them from walking directly into capture. They fled back into the city, now hunted in an urban environment where their options were even more limited. The money that should have bought passage north had nearly bought their deaths instead, and Catherine understood that trust itself had become a luxury they could no longer afford. The choice no one should have to make. Cornered in New Orleans with no resources, no allies, and slave catchers closing in, Catherine and Marcus faced an impossible decision that would haunt whichever of them survived to remember it. They had fled the docks and taken refuge in an abandoned warehouse near the French Quarter, a structure scheduled for demolition that provided temporary shelter, but no long-term safety. Solomon had been captured during their flight through the city, seized by slave catchers who had been patrolling the streets, looking for exactly the kind of fugitives they represented. The trap was tightening with geometric inevitability. Descriptions of Catherine and Marcus had been circulated to every inn, boarding house, and business in New Orleans. The church had increased the reward for their capture, and the Mother Superior had arrived personally to coordinate the search, driven by fury and desperation, to contain a scandal that threatened the diocese's reputation. They had perhaps 24 hours before someone noticed them, before their luck exhausted itself, before the warehouse that sheltered them became a prison. On December 23, 1838, in the dim light filtering through broken windows, Catherine and Marcus spent what they both knew might be their last hours together, and confronted the choice that neither wanted to make. Marcus argued that they should separate, that Catherine should turn herself in to church authorities and claim she had been abducted, coerced, overcome by temporary madness brought on by the fire's trauma. A nun might receive mercy, might be confined to a convent for penance rather than prosecuted criminally. But Marcus himself would receive no mercy if captured. Catherine refused initially, insisting they would escape together or die together, that she would not save herself by sacrificing him. But Marcus pressed the logic that destroyed her resistance. She was carrying his child, a child who deserved a chance at life, even if they did not. If Catherine surrendered and negotiated carefully, she might survive long enough to bear the child, might even arrange for the baby to be raised by her sister, rather than taken by the church. The pregnancy that had seemed like proof of their love now became the argument that forced them apart. Catherine understood that Marcus was right, that her continued flight endangered not just herself, but the innocent life growing inside her, that motherhood demanded sacrifices she had not anticipated when she first broke her vows. In the end, Catherine made the decision that would haunt her remaining years. She would return to the church, would confess everything, and would use what little leverage she possessed to negotiate Marcus's freedom. She carried copies of documents from the secret ledger, evidence of the church's systematic corruption that she would threaten to make public, unless certain conditions were met. The church valued reputation above almost everything else, and Catherine would trade her silence for Marcus's life. They said goodbye in that abandoned warehouse, two people who had found unexpected love in impossible circumstances, now forced apart by the same systems that had brought them together. The ending, written in silence. Sister Mary Catherine returned to the Convent of the Sacred Heart on Christmas Eve, 1838, escorted not by slave catchers but by two church officials who met her at a predetermined location and transported her with discretion that suggested the Mother Superior understood exactly what Catherine possessed and what damage it could cause. The negotiations that followed occurred behind closed doors, involving the bishop himself, the Mother Superior, two church lawyers, and Catherine, who sat pregnant and exhausted but surprisingly calm as she detailed what she knew and what she wanted. The secret ledger's contents provided devastating leverage. Catherine had documentation of decades of human trafficking, of families deliberately separated for profit, of problematic enslaved people disposed of through methods the church could never publicly acknowledge. If this information reached abolitionist newspapers in the North, if it became ammunition for critics who argued that Catholic institutions were morally compromised by their participation in slavery, the reputational damage would be catastrophic. Catherine's demands were simple. Marcus's freedom, documented and legal, with papers that would allow him to travel north without harassment. Daniel's freedom as well, as he had been recaptured and faced punishment for his escape attempt. Enough money to ensure both men could establish themselves in free states. And for herself, confinement, rather than prosecution, her child to be born and given to her sister Marianne for raising, rather than taken by the church. The bishop agreed to all conditions with a speed that revealed how desperate the church was to contain the scandal. But what happened next was never officially recorded, buried beneath layers of institutional secrecy that the church had perfected over centuries of managing uncomfortable truths. Catherine was transferred to a remote convent in rural Kentucky, her pregnancy attributed to a brief marriage before taking vows, a fiction that satisfied no one but allowed everyone to avoid uncomfortable questions. She gave birth to a son in February 1844, a child who was immediately given to Marianne as arranged, and Catherine never saw him again, never learned whether Marcus ever knew he had a son, never discovered if the promises made were actually kept. As for Marcus, the historical record becomes deliberately opaque. Plantation ledgers show him listed as sold and transferred in January 1839, but there is no record of buyer, price, or destination. Some historians believe Catherine's confession secured his quiet manumission, that the church paid to send him north in exchange for her permanent silence. Others believe he was simply killed, and the paperwork fabricated to hide murder that avoided the scandal of a public trial. The truth, like so many truths about that era, was buried beneath official lies and convenient forgetting. Catherine lived until 1867, dying in the Kentucky convent where she had spent nearly 30 years in enforced silence. Her story known to no one, her love affair reduced to a notation in sealed church archives that would not be opened for over a century. The file marked, Sister Mary Catherine, resolved 1842. Not for public record contained only documents, never revealing whether resolution meant freedom or death.